Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And welcoming to the Newsmaker Show, Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure, as usual.
Would you like to start out with the topic of Afghanistan, Dr. Ostrower?
Yeah, I would like to say something about Afghanistan because there was a vote in the U.S. Senate just last week that I found to be surprising and important. And it was a vote in which the Senate, by a margin of 68 in favor of this resolution to, I believe, 23 opposed, essentially repudiated the position of the president in respect to the withdrawal of troops from both Syria and from Afghanistan. And as I can see this, it's, I think, the first time that the Senate, that the Republican-led Senate, has gone on record as opposing the president since his inauguration in 2017. And, you know, what I suspect is that, yeah, the Senate is beginning to, you know, show a little bit of independence. Now, whether this will be followed up on other votes, on other issues, it remains to be seen. But the issue of withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to remain it's a difficult one. And I think that reasonable people can disagree on this. I heard one of your guests the other day saying that, well, the opposition to withdrawal is being driven by the Israelis. Somehow or another, he brings in the Israelis as if, you know, they're controlling American politics, which is kind of an old story. You know, the Jews control the government and the world and so forth and so on. I have very, very little tolerance for that sort of thing. But there is a serious issue over here as to whether or not the United States should withdraw. The U.S. has a record, and this goes all the way back to Vietnam, of, in a way, abandoning allies without in any serious way consulting with those allies. I think we saw this way back during the Vietnam War with South Vietnam. It's occurred at other times when we abandoned, for instance, the Shah of Iran, when we abandoned the president of Morsi, not Morsi, but Mubarak in Egypt a few years ago. It happened in 1983 in Lebanon. And let me just say something, if I may, about that Lebanon thing, because it connects with Syria and it connects with Afghanistan. In 1982 and 1983, the U.S. had sent in some troops, Marines mainly, to kind of quell a civil war in Lebanon. And I think that some of our listeners may remember that some Iranian-backed guerrillas, some terrorists in Lebanon, blew up a Marine barracks that we had there, killing about 240 Marines. That was no small thing. And as a result of that, President Reagan, at the time, pulled the Marines out of Lebanon, at least off the ground, put them onto ships offshore. But we were not leaving. And the reason we weren't leaving is because we were supporting a Lebanese group, a Christian group in Lebanon, against the majority Muslim faction in Lebanon. And when I say supporting them, I mean providing them with protection, and providing them with protection in the sense that we would keep the civil war quiet. We would try as best we could to prevent the outbreak or the resumption, if you will, of what had been a very, very nasty civil war there. Well, about 6 months or so after we put those troops onto ships, we very, very quietly left. The ships simply sailed away in the middle of the night. There was no announcement on TV. There was no press conference. They were simply gone. And our allies in Lebanon were therefore left on their own, and they didn't do very well in light of subsequent developments. It was not, I think, a very distinguished moment in American history. We abandoned some of our allies in Iraq back in 2010. Now, what's going on, I think, is that, you know, great powers, we're a great power, great powers will protect themselves. They'll pursue their own interests. We say that we're going to protect, our allies, but we don't always do it. And we're not the only ones, I might add, that does this kind of thing. I think that the Russians did this in some ways in Afghanistan way back in the 1980s. But nevertheless, it is not a very, it's not a very laudable enterprise. And I think that's the situation we're in Afghanistan right now. The Afghani government does not want us to leave. The Taliban, the other side, the Taliban won't even recognize the existence of the Afghani government. They will not sit down and negotiate with the Afghani government. They'll negotiate with us, but they will not negotiate with a legitimate government there. And for that reason, I think, we should be very, very careful about leaving. On the other hand, we've been there for 17 years. We've lost approximately 3,500 men killed in action and about 7,000 or so who have been injured, who have been wounded. There's no end in sight. We are not winning that war. The likelihood is that we are not going to win the war. It's a stalemate at best. And while Trump may have said, we're there to, achieve victory, the fact is that we're not going to achieve victory. And I think that finally the president has come to that realization, which is one of the reasons why he's saying we should get out. So, we may protect our own interests by getting out. But by the same token, I think that, one has to take into account that there are other interests that perhaps we should be seriously considering.
So you think this is kind of a letdown as far as Afghanistan goes for the nation of Afghanistan? What do you predict tonight for the State of the Union, Dr. Ostrower?
I wish I knew. I have a hunch that the president is going to, in fact, declare a state of emergency. And he's going to declare a state of emergency, I suspect, because he feels boxed in. He made a promise, a political promise, okay, a campaign promise, back in 2016 that he would build a wall. And every time he said the word wall, his base, okay, those supporters, those thousands of people at his rallies would get riled up, okay? It was irrational, perhaps, but they got really, really excited. And so this became, in some ways, the centerpiece of his campaign. If he doesn't get his wall, he's going to believe, I think, that, he failed. He's going to view himself as a, quote, loser. And he's the kind of president, the kind of person who believes that when he wins, the other side loses. There's no such thing as a win-win situation. And that's why I believe he's really unwilling, in a serious way, to negotiate with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in the House of Representatives. So for Trump, it's really all or nothing. And to the extent that it's all or nothing, he may feel the only way that he can get that wall, the only way that he can protect himself against the criticism of people like Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh, and maybe even on this kind of an issue, Sean Hannity, the only way that he can get their support is if he declares this national emergency. But declaring national emergencies is very, very serious business. It gives the president's powers that he would not otherwise have. And I think for President Trump, this is not an issue. I don't think that he has ever read the Constitution. I don't think that he understands the Constitution. I don't think that he respects the Constitution. And what the Constitution does is to place limited power in the hands of the president, limited power in the hands of the Congress, and also of the courts. I don't think that that President Trump respects that, which is one of the reasons why he does so kind of fawn after, so praise people like Putin and the North Korean leader Kim. Okay, people, in other words, who don't have to worry about limits on their own power. So I think that this man is in the process of changing American politics, of American government, and some of these changes may turn out to be permanent.
Dr. Ostrower, Senator Schumer is on the receiving end of some critical headlines this morning. A couple headlines from CNBC. Sanders and Schumer's buyback plan is treating the wrong problem, says economist. Another headline from CNBC. The Sanders-Schumer proposal to limit buybacks could be very negative for the stock market. Now, yesterday, Schumer was getting hit hard by a state news website, EmpireReportNewYork.com, yesterday and the day before. There were headlines about Schumer criticizing Wall Street, and right underneath it, there was a headline that said Schumer's Wall Street backers, an obvious slam on Schumer from the EmpireReportNewYork.com. What do you make of this negative publicity? I thought that was kind of unusual for CNBC to do that. I don't think of them as a conservative news outlet, and I don't really think of Empire Report New York as being conservative either.
Well, let's clarify. When you're talking about the buybacks, I'm a little unclear about what it is exactly that's being bought back. So clarify that, and then perhaps I can respond a little bit more sensibly on what we're talking about.
Okay, pulling up CNBC.com, they would Senator Schumer and Sanders outlined a planned money that would restrict how companies repurchase their own shares. One Wall Street veteran estimated such a move could have meaningful impact on stocks. And Wall Street, which have relied on buybacks and federal intervention since during the bull market that started in 2009, the plan faces roadblocks in the Senate and likely from Senator Schumer. Let's see. Let's see if they mention any specific companies in this article, and I don't see any. It says, although it does say big tech companies and Wall Street banks are usually the leaders in gross purchases. Apple has executed more than $250 billion in repurchases, according to S&P Dow Jones information. Wells Fargo did more than $63 billion. Microsoft went over $100 billion.
Well, let me then talk about something that I really do not know very much about. So you all stand warned here. When the tax bill was passed last year, it was a huge tax bill. It's going to send our deficit in excess of $1.3 trillion over the course of 10 years or so. It's really it's going to have a stunning effect on our deficit, and we don't see that going down. That deficit is going to continue. Certainly our national debt over $1 trillion each year, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Now for the next maybe the next 4 or 5 years or so. Who has benefited therefore from that tax cut? And the answer is, for the most part, wealthy Americans, and this is where your question comes in, and corporations. And so what corporations are doing is taking the money that they have gained, if you will, that they saved from the tax cut, and they're buying back their own stock. Now, what that means is that the tax cut really did not help most people who are listening to this program. 83% of the of that tax cut is going to the wealthiest Americans. It's going to the corporations. Should the companies be able to use that money to buy back their stock? Should they not be willing to use it to lower prices of goods, to make consumer goods or services, tech services and so forth, more affordable for the average American? What people like Schumer and what people like Bernie Sanders are saying is, yeah, they should. Okay, that the public should benefit rather than the wealthy corporations benefit. And yet, I think that someone like Schumer, and again, I'm kind of speculating here, on one level, Schumer wants to appear as a champion of the consumer. On another level, he receives a good deal of aid, as he has over the course of the years, from Wall Street, which is located in New York, obviously, in his own senatorial district, in a sense. And so I think he's, I don't know where he's going to wind up on all of this. He's trying to please both sides, and maybe he'll be successful. I mean, he's certainly a popular politician, and I don't see any likelihood that he's going to lose an election when he's next running here in New York State. But I think that he's going to be criticized by one side or the other. And if you're in politics, you better be willing to be criticized by one side or the other. If you can't take criticism, then you're in the wrong job. You got the wrong field.
Boy, you got that right, Dr. Ostrower. It's AM 1480 WLEA. It's the Newsmaker Show. Going to take a quick break, check the forecast. We'll be back with This Day in History with Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Want your vehicle looking just like it did when you drove it out of the dealership? Then stop by RBS Auto Detailing on Canisteo and Pine Streets in Hornell. RBS Auto Detailing. The before and after photos of your vehicle won't come close to showing the great job they'll do for you. Cleaning, washing, and waxing. They can get your vehicle looking nice and new both inside and out. RBS Auto Detailing on the corner of Canisteo and Pine Streets in Hornell.
Checking in with meteorologist Rob Carroll. You called yesterday, right, Rob? It was a lot warmer than expected. Will that continue today?
Well, we're actually headed in the opposite direction, Brian. We had a cold front sweep through the area earlier this morning. A little shower activity went through. Now the colder air is pushing in. As I look back to the west, it's down to 41 in Dunkirk, 37 in Buffalo right now, and some of that cooler air is headed our way. I think we're going to fall to about 45, hold there for a while, and then later this afternoon we'll start to go down some more. Certainly also looks like we're going to be dealing with a fair amount of cloudiness. As I look at the satellite photos right now, a lot of cloudiness from our area back to the west across the lakes and on into Michigan. Sunrise this morning was at 7:18. It'll set tonight at 5:30. Now tonight we will see partial clearing as colder, drier weather moves in overnight, lows 20 to 25. We're going to see a storm system head our way tomorrow. We'll cloud up quickly. Rain's going to develop tomorrow afternoon. Highs will be near 40. The rain will end tomorrow night. Lows will drop to 30 to 35. Storm number 2 heads our way on Thursday. That'll bring us rain Thursday afternoon. Also pushes the milder weather back in, 50 to 55. Then look for it to turn much colder, Brian, for Friday and into the upcoming weekend.
Back on the Newsmaker Show on with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor. Turning now to history, it was on this day, February 5th, 1994, that Medgar Evers killer Byron Della Beckwith was convicted of killing civil rights leader Medgar Evers, and I think that was 1963, and it took a long time for that. Apparently, there was there were numerous trials on it. The NAACP pushed to get the case reopened, and quite the case. He was murdered in his driveway with his wife and kids inside the house in I believe, 1963. Dr. Ostrower, what do we know about Medgar Evers?
Well, let me answer that, but let me just, before I do answer that, let me mention one more comment, if I may, about what you had raised before about stock buybacks, because I didn't say this, and I think it's important to say. And here's why stock buybacks are so very, very controversial, and why, for instance, a senator like Schumer or someone else may get involved in this kind of a controversy. When companies buy back their own stocks, and they usually do it with hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, what they're doing is increasing the price of the shares that the executives of those companies own, or for that matter, that anyone owning shares in that company will own. So it serves their own immediate financial interest. But what it does not do is pour those hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars into additional investment, because additional investment will create jobs. That's really what, for instance, the tax bill of 2017 was supposed to do. It didn't do that. And it didn't do that in part because of all these stock buybacks. So I think that there's plenty of legitimate reason to criticize whether it's Schumer or anyone else, candidates who support that sort of thing. Going back to Medgar Evers, Medgar Evers was he was the head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, back in 1963 in the state of Mississippi. He had been a veteran. He had left the service, gone to college, to Alcorn College, and then he had become very, very much in civil rights activity in his own state. And of all the states in the Union back in that period, of all 50 states, Mississippi was in some ways the most committed to the old system of segregation. And Medgar Evers had been warned. He had been threatened many, many times. He was a brave guy. He really did have backbone. He had a lot of courage, and he refused to back down in respect to his efforts vis-a-vis voting rights, ending segregation in the public schools, and so forth. This is following the Brown v. Board of Ed decision, which mandated the end of segregation in public schools. It hadn't happened in Mississippi yet, and so he was killed for his efforts. He was murdered. Was he a martyr? Yeah, I think that in the way we usually use that term, he was a martyr to that cause. Because he was not a national figure, because he was really mainly a state-level figure in Mississippi, most Americans had not known who he was before the assassination. And it took, 35 years or whatever it is before Byron Della Beckwith was finally convicted. He went to jail. He was given a life sentence. And by the way, I should add that in 1964, Byron Della Beckwith was put on trial. He was acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury. He was then put on trial again. He wasn't acquitted, I'm sorry. It was a hung jury. There was another trial. Once again, there was a hung jury, even though the evidence was absolutely crystal clear that he had committed this murder. His fingerprints were on the gun. They absolutely knew which rifle had been used and whatnot. But a Mississippi white jury would not convict him. And so it was finally 35 years later, I think it was in 1994, that he was convicted. He was given a life sentence, and I don't remember exactly when he died. I think it was in 2001 or so. He was in jail for about 7 years, and then he passed away there.
Very interesting and sad story there, Dr. Ostrower. Yeah, being a civil rights leader in the 1960s, no doubt about it. All those guys were putting their lives on the line. You have a speaker coming up at Alfred University, I believe, to talk about the civil rights period in the 1960s.
Well, I sure do. We have a fellow coming in. He is the chairman of the history department at the University of Memphis. His name is Adam Gazurian. He is a specialist in that field. He's going to be speaking particularly about a year when I believe that Kevin Doran was down in Mississippi, as a matter of fact. A very, very eventful year. It was 1966. And it was during that year that two things happened, which are going to be of I think the centerpiece of the talk he's going to give at Alfred University on March 18th. March 18th, which is going to be in the evening at 7:30. He's going to be talking about a march called the Freedom March that was led by a fellow named James Meredith. James Meredith was the first black person to integrate the University of Mississippi Law School. President Kennedy, in order to get Meredith into the University of Mississippi Law School, had to mobilize, had to nationalize the Mississippi National Guard, had to send 4,000 U.S. Marshals into Oxford, Mississippi, where the university is located, had to send the 101st Airborne Division into Oxford, Mississippi. It was a major, major event in 1962. 40 years later, James Meredith, by now having graduated from the law school, led a march in Mississippi. It was called the Freedom March. Meredith was shot, almost killed. He wasn't, he was seriously wounded. And the Black Power movement, what we know as the Black Power movement, led by a guy named Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement emerged out of that march. That is going to be the subject of the talk by Professor Gazurian in March of this year, on March 18th.
Very interesting, Dr. Ostrower. We're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us for a very interesting show.
Thank you, and I'll talk to you next week.